Okay, so you can start counting. This is the title, but first I would like to give you a little bit of background. I grew up in Basel, Switzerland, where I attended the Mathematisch-Naturwissenschaftliche Gymnasium. That is a high school with emphasis on math and science, and that's also where I fell in love with geometry. This got reinforced during my university years when I heard my math lectures in this 500-year-old institute, where in the past many famous mathematicians have lectured, such as Jacob Bernoulli, inventor of the spiral, or Leonhard Euler. So in any assignment, I was always looking for the geometry component. And this was true when I was at Bell Labs, and I designed the charge-coupled device solid-state sensors for the first all-solid-state TV camera. I was still true when in 1976 I came to Berkeley, and together with Patterson we built the first single-chip reduced instruction set computer. And then in the 1990s I moved in geometry from 2 dimensions, layout of integrated circuits, to 3 dimensions, in particular the design of Soda Hall. And then 10 years later the 3D printers came along, and now I had even more 3D geometry, and now I could actually make physical output, as you can see on the table here, from all my creations. Now here are some results from the last 10 years. In the top row you can see some mathematical visualization models, such as the 3D Hilbert cube or the double boy Klein bottle. The 2 sculptures at the bottom row are joint work with Brent Collins, and that is what I want to focus on today. Obviously, you all know about Leonardo, Art and Science Evening Rendezvous. Okay? But there's also a journal named Leonardo, and I have a copy here. Okay? And in 1992, this journal had a special issue devoted to visual mathematics. And in that issue, there was an article by Professor George Francis from the University of Illinois, analyzing the artwork by sculptor Brent Collins. And that was one of the figures in the article, and there were several other figures in there. And they were kind of following in the same paradigm. Okay? You can clearly see some dominant motifs. There are a lot of tunnels, and then there are these very balanced saddles that look almost like pieces of soap films. And indeed, this is what I learned quite a bit later. Collins has no education in mathematics. He works with rulers and compasses, and any math that you might see in his early work is purely intuitive. He's inspired by nature, a keen observer, and in particular by things like soap film that form so-called minimal surfaces that are sort of totally balanced and have minimal total area given the boundary conditions. Now, George Francis analyzed Collins' sculptures in terms of the boundary curves, and then what kind of a soap film might be hanging in those boundary curves, so-called spanning surfaces. So let's look at the geometry of some of those elements that you can find in these kind of tunnel and saddle surfaces. Much of the geometry is closely related to something that's known to mathematicians as Shirk's second minimal surface. That was discovered in 1834. On the left, you see a model of this mathematical surface, but this is just a small piece of the whole surface because the surface goes off to infinity in all directions. But in the horizontal directions, the flanges just become essentially flat planes, and that is rather boring. So let's focus on the center of this surface, at the part with the interesting tunnel and saddle geometry. And we take a slice from that, and we give this surface some thickness so we get some physical reality. And this is what I call a shirk tower. In the simplest case, a shirk tower is just a stack of ordinary saddles like you might find on the back of a horse, and which are suitable for so-called bipeds, that is, human beings. Now, George Francis saw the connection between this abstract geometry and Collins' work. In particular, he saw that this hyperbolic hexagon by Brent Collins could be understood as a 6-story shirk tower that was then bent into a loop, into a toroidal ring. I came across this picture in 1994, and it prompted me to find out who this Collins guy really was, and how he conceived of these things, and how he constructed these beautiful objects. I picked up the phone, and our first phone conversation lasted about 45 minutes. It started by discussing this particular object, and among other things, we asked ourselves what might happen if we introduce more stories, and if we maybe give the tower a twist. So there's a twist in this particular ring. And to illustrate what might happen, here's an example. If we take the 4-story shirk tower that you see on the left and close it into a loop, straight, without any twist, then we get the result at the top right. It's nice and symmetrical, but somewhat boring. But if we give the tower a longitudinal twist of 180 degrees, as shown on the left, and then close it into a loop, we get what we see at the right bottom. It is less symmetric, but I believe more interesting. In our phone conversation, it also occurred to us that if we were to add an odd number of stories, then we would get a Mobius surface. Right now you see the top saddle is green, the bottom saddle is green. You bend them together into a loop, green meets green. But if you add one more story, then suddenly the top end would be yellow. And as you bend it into a loop, yellow meets green. That means you can go from one surface to the other. It's now single-sided, or what mathematicians call non-orientable. In addition, if you add a twist, then edges that before were closing into themselves, they now close into a different edge. So number 1 may go into number 3, and then number 3 may go back to number 1. So suddenly these edges become entangled, knotted things. And all of that sounded very intriguing. But the question, of course, is, does it make any good sculptures? So the first thing I did after hanging up the phone was to construct a skeleton of a hyperbolic hexagon by taping together 7 simple paper loops. And I found out later that Brent did exactly the same thing, except he used embroidery hoops. And you can see his skeleton here on the left. Now the question arises, will this eventually lead to a pleasing sculpture? Is it worthwhile for Brent to spend 2 or 3 months of hard work of carving and whittling and sanding in order to create an object, and then you look at it and go, blah, that doesn't look so good. Okay. What Brent normally does at this stage is to create a scaled-down mock-up model consisting of such a skeleton, some chicken wire, and then some beeswax in black. And that typically gives a good idea of what the final shape looks like. The problem is that it takes about 1 or 2 weeks to build such a model. And for a while, we talked on the phone almost every week, and every time we had at least 3 or 4 new ideas. So you can see there's no way that Brent could keep up with trying out all of these ideas. Well, computer to the rescue. To explore all these possibilities, I wrote a very special purpose computer program. The only thing that it could model was such a chain of saddles and tunnels. I called it somewhat pompously Sculpture Generator number 1. Okay. And here you see its graphical user interface. There are about 10 sliders here on the lower right that define the geometry of this shape. The order of the saddles, the number of saddles, their height, the width and thickness of the flanges, what you do with the edges, and then how much you bend that tower into just an arch or maybe into a loop, whether the edges are square or rounded. And here's a bunch of these so-called shirk Collins toroid that keep popping out of Sculpture Generator 1 literally within minutes as you move those sliders around and then select a few fancy colors or textures. And so with this program I could quickly create a whole lot of promising artistic shapes, some of which Brent liked enough so that he would actually want to spend 3 months of his life of carving them at the 2 or 3 foot scale. Here's a picture of Brent Collins holding our first truly collaborative piece, which we called Hyperbolic Hexagon 2. It also has 6 stories, but now those saddles are monkey saddles with 3 valleys, 2 for the legs and 1 for the tail. Now I will show the process by which something like that comes into existence. Here is a way how Brent typically builds his larger wood sculptures. With rulers and compasses, he constructs slices through the desired geometry at different levels. Then he cuts out various layers in wood boards and glues them together. And you can see the laminating process there on the left. And in this way, he made himself this outer part of a torus surface here, on which he could then sketch out those wavy patterns that look a little bit like the undulations reminiscent of the protuberances of the solar surface, and that's why the end result here is called vox solis. So decomposition, a complex shape into discrete layers, is the key step. And that's what I then added into my sculpture generator. So in the sculpture generator, I could create these layers to whatever size and however many boards that Brent planned to use. What you see here is one of the blueprints, 3 feet by 3 feet, that I sent to Brent Collins for our second major piece. It's called Heptoroid. And what he will do is then cut out with a saber saw outside the outline of these various curves and glue them together, properly lined up, and he gets an object that sort of looks like that. Now the beauty is that all the overall symmetry and the gross structure is locked in, so that cannot get messed up. And of course, in the fine details, it doesn't look beautiful at all. You can see very strong staircasing, which is like 7/8 step, because that's how thick the boards are. So it takes him about a month where he starts grinding down and whittling down and smoothing everything out. And you can see now a continuous rim emerges and the staircasing is essentially gone. The rim is maybe about 1 inch wide. And in this case, the rim was traveling 8 times around the toroid loop before it met back up onto itself. And that is because the overall shirk tower had been given a twist of 135 degrees, and that's like 3/8 of a full turn of 360 degrees. After about another month of work, Brent has reduced the thickness even further. Everything gets nice and smooth. And now we can start to see the glue lines between the various boards. And if they're nice and hyperbolic, that's like visual feedback, that you have very nicely curved surfaces like you might find in the soap film. And this visual feedback together with the tactile feedback that he gets from actually touching the surface, allows him to really make a beautiful art object out of this very simple sort of mathematical shape. Here is the finished piece. We called it heptoroid because it has 7 fourth-order saddles, 4 valleys going down. We could call it a tiger saddle because when he lies up on the branches, he hangs down 4 limbs. It was exhibited at the Art Gallery at the Firma Accelerator Lab near Chicago, and everybody there seemed to be intrigued by it. But everybody saw something different. Some people thought, oh yeah, that is the topology of the stellarator fusion reactor. Other people thought, no, that looks more like the head of the tunnel boring machine that we used in order to create a tunnel for the accelerator. And then maybe some of the string theoreticians thought that this might be the inner structure of the quark. Well, this thing was 4 feet tall, but of course every artist dreams about seeing his or her sculpture at a much larger scale. And indeed, 5 years later, we got a chance to build such a thing at the 12-foot scale. But it was constructed in snow. This happened at the annual Snow Sculpting Championship in Breckenridge, Colorado in January 2003. Every year they're holding this competition. Out of a proposal selected, they choose about 15 that they actually get invited. And in 5 days, with a team of 5 people, they can carve whatever they like out of a big block of hard, compact snow, 10 by 10 by 12 feet tall. And that's what we did. And we called the thing the World Wide Web, for obvious reasons. And the jury loved it, and they thought it was very 21st century. And indeed, it looks really good, even at 12:40, at the Sunday, Saturday morning, after jury had been taking place. It was a lovely piece. And when the lady took her photograph, she heard this whoosh. And at 12:41, that's what it looked like. And you notice the temperature is 42 degrees, and that's just not very good for snow sculpting. And so that's very sad, but fortunately, the judging had ended at noon, and the jury stood by their decision, reached 45 minutes earlier, and they still gave us the silver medal, which we proudly displayed here on our sculpture, showing the little green model. Says, believe us, it was just as beautiful as this one. Phew. Nevertheless, you probably understand why I was eager to build sculptures from more durable materials. Well, that opportunity came up about 4 years later, when Brent received a commission from the community center in Overland Park, a suburb of Kansas City. They wanted an indoor sculpture to be suspended in an atrium. We submitted this design coming out of my generator. On the right you can see the various parameters. In this case we have 12 fourth-order saddles in the circular loop, and the complete ring exhibits 3/4 of a full turn of twisting. I would like to call this object the solar circle, because to me there was an obvious correspondence between its 12 houses and the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, with the help of this man, David Lynn from Nova Blue Studio Arts, we got the chance of realizing the sculpture on a 10-foot diameter scale. Our customers wanted a lightweight indoor sculpture, possibly slightly translucent, and so David cast the sculpture in epoxy and polyester resin. This is quite an elaborate multi-phase process. In the following, I'll give you a glimpse of how this works. First of all, here's the full-size master geometry module, machined from high-density styrofoam on a numerically controlled milling machine, and it has then been coated with clay in order to make the surface really nice and smooth for mold making. It represents 1/6 of the complete sculpture, and thus we have to put together 6 elements just like this one. Around this master module, a negative mold is made out of silicon rubber first, and then sheets of fiberglass, and then epoxy. And in this mold, 6 copies are then cast in this yellow polyester material that you see on the right. 6 of these elements are assembled into 2 semicircles with 10-foot diameter, and then these were then carried to the atrium where they were supposed to be hung. Why didn't we finish the ring? Well, the ring would not have fit through the doors. So they were combined on the floor of the atrium where the sculpture was to be hung. The edges had to be carefully lined up, and then they were epoxied together, and there was some light and heat used in order to accelerate the curing process and make a firm junction. And about 48 later, it was strong enough that it could actually be hoisted up in place. And here on the left, you see artist Brent Collins. On the right, the fabricator David Lynn. And in the back, you can just see barely a man on the track of the gym of this community center. This is what it looks like at night from below towards the skylight. Our customers wanted to call it the Millennium Arch. And that was fine with us as long as they paid the bills. And actually, it prompted Brent Collins to take this photograph, which is a takeoff on the famous Vitruvian Man. Yet another connection to Leonardo. So the success of this sculpture led to another commission in 2010. At that time, Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph had just refurbished a new science building and wanted a couple of sculptures in the style of Collins' work. So this gave us the opportunity of trying out some advanced ideas. I proposed to wind up a long 24-story shirk tower into a simple knot. And this led to the concept of evolving trefoil. On the right, you can see a quick mock-up, which I sent to Brent. This is just a rough approximation of 12 circular arches that just stuck together on the computer. And he liked it and told me to go for it, for real. Well, there was just one problem, and that is that the old sculpture generator could not handle such a complex sweep through 3D space. So I had to enlist the role of one of my undergraduate students, and he helped me to expand the capabilities of this generator. And now we have a generator that can actually run such a sequence of tunnels and saddles around an arbitrary E-spline. And this got us to the chosen name, evolving trefoil. It reflects the fact that this concept came out of a lengthy evolution of ideas and forms, several of which you have seen in my slides. At the bottom right is the final design for evolving trefoil. This sculpture, again, could be partitioned into 6 identical modules, each comprising 4 individual stories. And so that's what the module looked like. And of course, I first had to try it out on a rapid prototyping machine. I didn't want to screw up, and I really had to see whether these things would go together. And if you take 6 of them, it makes this nice, wonderful knot. Right? And so this was more complicated than the first one, but the principle is the same. You basically start to build the master module, except it's much bigger now. And you can see it on the left, and this time it's kind of brown clay that makes a smooth surface. And then around this module, you form again the silicon rubber, fiberglass, epoxy mold. This time it has about 20 pieces. And they had to color code them in order to make sure that you could put it together repeatedly and in the right manner. Now, on the inside of each one of these sections of the mold, in tedious handwork, you build up a surface element of the final sculpture, again from fiberglass and epoxy. This is the white stuff that you see here. When you've done it to all the plates, you put the whole mold together, and then you fill the whole thing with syrup out of epoxy resins, crushed minerals, and some catalyst. This thing now weighs about 300 pounds, and what you have to do is slowly kind of rotate it along its longitudinal axis and rock it back and forth so that that syrup really fills all the nooks and crannies and makes a nice smooth surface. And then you have to do it 6 times. I actually found out later they had to do it 8 times because twice it just didn't make a nice enough surface. Anyhow, 6 of these units make the whole thing. Here you see first 3 of them together in a tentative setup. You know, a few weeks later there were 6 of them, and all of those were then transported to Missouri Western St. Joseph. They laid out on the atrium floor, and then they started assembling them there. About halfway done. Here they're almost done. And here they're completely done, and now it's ready to be hoisted up there in the air. And that's almost in the final position, and to me it looks almost like some kind of a dinosaur bone that they're hanging up there. And here it is in this final resting place. This is inside a 3-story atrium, and it's wonderful to have a 3-story atrium, because you can see it from below, you can see it from above, at eye level, and every direction you look at, this piece looks really different. And so there are some very, very happy campers here. I know I'm out of time, and so if somebody asks me, what have you done since, then I have another 4 minutes. Any questions?
What have you done since?
Okay, I'm glad to ask.
So that's the only question you get, huh?
Yeah. Here is another shape that came out of my original sculpture generator. It's a slightly twisted shirk tower with 4 monkey saddles. It's beautifully rendered in a ray tracing program by one of my students. Now, thanks to the wonder of 3D printing, and you can see that one here, and I give it around for you to touch, I can readily make a copy of something like that on a 3D printer. And actually, I sent this piece to Southeast China, to a corporation that's Dingley Art Company, and they scaled it up by a factor of 8 and carved it from solid green granite. This is the same place that actually carved the MLK monument in Washington, D.C. Did you know that was made in China? Basically, they sent a plaster model out to them and said, you know, scale it up 20 times. And they created, you know, about 50 or more, 3 by 3 feet blocks, shipped them by containers. They got all piled together, and there is your monument. Anyhow, that's what the sculpture looked like just shortly before it was put in a crate and shipped to Oakland. And sometime spring 2012, these 2 cases arrived. This is the content of one of them. The other one was containing the black silicon base from granite. And here we put the 2 pieces together, and we were very happy campers because we could do it without any nicks or scratches or anything like that. And it really needs to be taken care of that way because the craftsmanship is absolutely superb. You should go and check it out. It's on the 6th floor terrace of Sutarchadai Hall, and just run your fingers along the edges, and there are no unevenness or anything like that. It's just beautiful, beautiful work. And you can even look at the bases on the inside. Everything is totally wonderful and smooth. And I just wonder how many Chinese children were there, sandpaper. 3 more slides just to dispel the notion that this is the only concept that Brent Collins has. I focused on these minimal surfaces, but Brent does other things. And here on the left, you see a sculpture that he did in 1996, which we called Pax Mundi, Peace on Earth. And I liked it so much that I also captured it in another computer program. So when, in 2007, Brent received a commission to create a large-scale bronze version of this particular sculpture for the headquarter building of H&R Block in Kansas City. Who does their taxes at H&R Block? You're my sponsors. Yes, you didn't know. So I was ready to help them. Now, this kind of shape requires a completely different kind of generator. This time, together with my students, we built a much more modular and expansible CAD framework called Berkeley Slide. And here we can see its graphical user interface, what it looked like when I had to redesign Pax Mundi to be remade as a large bronze cast. The success of this Pax Mundi sculpture, our first large bronze sculpture, also gave us a commission to also do an outdoor sculpture for Missouri Western State University at St. Joseph. And this one we called Music of the Spheres. It required a quite different fabrication process from the one I showed you for involving trefoil, but this is another story. And so I would conclude here with a picture of the final installation of Music of the Spheres. And I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to my collaborators and to all the other individuals who make it possible to realize these wonderful sculptures. And thank you for your patience.